Baba Sunday, what do we do?
We do not turn back, but we cannot continue on this road. If they suspect where we are, they will
called this morning. They are sending an investigator to interview all current and former household staff before the court date. They want to speak to the girl. They specifically asked about a house help from a man's village. Someone has been talking Sunday. Someone has told them things they should never have known. Bring her back to this house right now, or you will not have a job to return to. The line went dead. For a long, terrible moment, the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine and the distant honking of traffic on the highway behind them. Ifeoma's eyes met Baba Sunday's in the rearview mirror, and she saw in his weathered face the same impossible calculation tearing through her own mind. If they turned back now, Ifeoma would be walking straight into the hands of a woman who had just learned that the very truth she had spent 26 years burying was about to be dragged into a courtroom. A woman desperate enough to have already discussed handling the problem completely. If they did not turn back, Baba Sunday would lose the only livelihood he had built over nearly 3 decades, and both of them would become fugitives from a family with more money and more power than either of them could ever hope to outrun. Baba Sunday, Ifeoma whispered, her voice shaking. What do we do? The old man's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had known him, Ifeoma saw something fierce ignite behind his tired eyes. The look of a man who had spent nearly 3 decades swallowing his conscience, finally deciding he would swallow it no longer. We do not turn back, he said quietly. But we cannot continue on this road either. If they suspect where we are, they will send someone faster than this old car can drive. He glanced once more at the mirror, his eyes meeting Ifeoma's with a grim resolve. Hold on tight, my daughter. We are taking the back roads. The car lurched suddenly to the left, tires screeching as Baba Sunday swung off the highway onto a narrow bush path that Ifeoma had not even noticed until they were already barreling down it, dust and gravel spitting up behind them in a great cloud. Branches scraped against the windows. The car bounced violently over ruts and potholes, throwing Ifeoma hard against her seatbelt, but she did not cry out. She gripped the photograph in her lap and stared straight ahead, her heart hammering with a terror so total it had somehow transformed, at the very edges, into something like fierce, desperate hope. They drove like that for nearly 20 minutes, weaving through back roads Ifeoma did not recognize, Baba Sunday's weathered hands steady on the wheel despite the sweat beading visibly on his forehead. Finally, as they emerged onto a quieter stretch of road lined with palm trees, his phone began ringing again. Not Madame Beatrice's number this time, Ifeoma saw, glancing at the screen, but an unknown number with a Lagos area code. Baba Sunday did not answer it. He simply reached over without taking his eyes off the road, and switched the phone off entirely, tossing it onto the dashboard. They will trace it if I leave it on, he muttered, more to himself than to Ifeoma. I should have thought of that sooner. Forgive an old man's slow mind. It was nearly 2 hours later, as the car finally slowed on the outskirts of a small town neither of them had ever visited before, that Ifeoma allowed herself, for the first time since climbing into that back seat that morning, to breathe fully. "Oh, Arinta," Baba Sunday said quietly, gesturing toward a faded signboard half swallowed by overgrown grass at the roadside. "We are close now. If Nurse Patience is still alive, if she still remembers that night 26 years ago, we will find her. And then, my daughter, we will finally know the truth that has been hiding inside you your entire life." But as the old sedan rolled slowly into the quiet town, neither of them noticed the black motorbike that had been trailing patiently, carefully, 3 cars behind them since the toll gate, nor the man riding it, speaking quietly into a phone tucked against his shoulder, relaying their exact location to a voice on the other end that Ifeoma would have recognized instantly, and that made her blood run cold every single time she heard it. "Yes, madam," the man on the motorbike said. "I have found them. They are heading into Orinta as we speak. What would you like me to do?" "Not yet," came the voice on the other end of the line, tight and controlled despite the panic threading beneath it. "Do not approach them. Just watch. Tell me everywhere they go, everyone they speak to. I need to know exactly what that old fool is planning before I decide how to handle this." The man on the motorbike killed his engine 2 streets behind the sedan, pulling into the shade of a mechanic's shed, his eyes never leaving the direction Baba Sunday had turned. He was patient. He had been paid to be patient. and patience, Madame Beatrice had learned over 26 years of guarding her secret, was always cheaper than the alternative. Inside the sedan, unaware that they had already been found, Ifeoma and Baba Sunday rolled slowly through the narrow streets of Orinta, asking directions from market women and Okada riders, following a trail of half-remembered names and old church records toward a small bungalow at the edge of town, painted a faded yellow that had once, decades ago, probably been much brighter. An elderly woman answered the door on the third knock, her back slightly bent with age, her eyes clouded but still sharp with the particular alertness of someone who has spent a lifetime paying close attention to details others miss. She wore a simple wrapper and a faded headscarf, and when Baba Sunday spoke her name, Nurse Patience, something in her expression shifted instantly from polite curiosity to something far more guarded. "Who is asking?" she said, her hand tightening slightly on the door frame. "My name is Sunday. I used to drive for the IB family in Lagos. 26 years ago, I drove Madame Beatrice IB to a man's village, to the health center where you once worked. I have never forgotten that night, and I do not believe you have either." The old nurse's face went pale beneath her dark skin. For a long moment, she simply stared at them, her eyes moving slowly from Baba Sunday's weathered face to Ifeoma standing quietly behind him. And when her gaze finally settled on Ifeoma's features, the sharp jawline, the almond-shaped eyes, the particular tilt of her chin, something like recognition, and grief, and fear all passed across her face at once. "Come inside," she said quietly, glancing nervously up and down the empty street before ushering them through the door. "Quickly, before anyone sees you standing here." The bungalow's small parlor smelled of camphor and old wood, its walls lined with faded photographs and a single crucifix hanging slightly crooked above a worn sofa. Nurse Patience did not sit immediately. She stood by the window for a long time, peering through the curtains as though checking for followers, before finally lowering herself slowly into a chair across from them, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trembling. "I have waited 26 years for someone to knock on that door and ask me this question," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have prayed some nights that I would die before it happened, and other nights I have prayed the opposite, that God would forgive me only if I finally told the truth before I left this world." Ifeoma's chest tightened so hard she could barely breathe. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, Nurse Patience. I need to know. Am I?" She could not finish the sentence. She did not know how to give voice to the impossible question that had been building inside her for weeks. The old nurse closed her eyes briefly, as though gathering strength from some deep, exhausted well. And when she opened them again, tears were already gathering at the corners. "Your mother," she said slowly, looking directly at Ifeoma. "Your real mother was a very frightened, very young woman. Not Mama Adiz, my daughter. I do not mean her. I mean the woman who carried you in her womb for 9 months and gave birth to you at St. Augustine's Hospital in Umuahia, in a private wing reserved for wealthy families. Her name was Ngozi Ibe." The room seemed to tilt around Ifeoma. "Ngozi. Chief Ibe's first wife," Nurse Patience continued softly. "Before Beatrice. Before any of what you have known your entire life. Ngozi was Chief Ibe's true love, my daughter. A quiet, gentle woman he married when they were both young and had nothing but each other. When she became pregnant with you, after nearly a decade of trying, after so many losses that had nearly broken her spirit entirely, the whole family celebrated. Chief Ibe had already built the beginnings of his oil business by then, and he wanted nothing but the best for his wife and his long-awaited child. Then what happened?" Ifeoma whispered, though some terrible part of her already suspected the shape of the answer. "Beatrice," the old nurse said, her voice hardening slightly with old, buried anger, "was Ngozi's younger cousin. She had come to stay with them during the final months of the pregnancy, to help care for the household. But Beatrice had always wanted what Ngozi had, the money, the status, the husband who adored his wife with a devotion Beatrice had never once been shown by any man in her own life. When Ngozi went into early labor at 7 months, complications neither the family nor the hospital had anticipated, it was Beatrice who rushed her to St. Augustine's. It was Beatrice who was alone in that hospital room during the final, most dangerous hours, while Chief Ibe was still traveling back from a business trip in Port Harcourt. unable to reach the hospital in time. Nurse Patience's hands trembled visibly now, twisting the edge of her wrapper. I was a young nurse on duty that night, assigned to assist with the delivery. Ngozi survived the birth, though barely. She was gravely weak, drifting in and out of consciousness from the blood loss, unable to fully register what was happening around her. And in the chaos of that night, with Chief Ibe still hours away, Beatrice made a decision that would poison every single day of her life afterward, though she would spend the next 26 years pretending it had made her happy. What did she do? Baba Sunday asked quietly, though something in his weathered face suggested he was beginning to understand. There was another woman in the maternity ward that same night. Nurse Patience continued, her voice dropping even lower. A poor village woman from a man's who had also just given birth. A healthy baby girl, her third child, born into a family already struggling to feed the children they had. Beatrice had overheard the woman weeping to another patient, terrified about how she would ever afford another mouth to feed, terrified her husband would be angry at yet another daughter when they had prayed so hard for a son. Beatrice saw an opportunity in that woman's desperation. She approached her privately, offered her a sum of money that must have seemed like an impossible fortune to a woman in that condition, and made a proposal that should never have been made, and should certainly never have been accepted. Ifeoma's entire body had gone cold and numb, every nerve straining toward a truth she both desperately wanted and desperately feared. She proposed, Nurse Patience said, tears now falling freely down her weathered cheeks, that the two babies be switched. Beatrice would take the healthy village baby and present her to Chief Ibe as his and Ngozi's daughter, born strong and well despite the frightening early labor. And the desperate village mother would take home Ngozi's true daughter, along with enough money to ease her family's poverty for years. But why would Ngozi's own baby? Ifeoma's voice broke completely. Because Ngozi's baby, Nurse Patience whispered, born 7 weeks early, weak and struggling to breathe, required weeks of expensive incubator care that the small government-adjacent private wing was not fully equipped to provide long-term. Beatrice did not want to raise a fragile child who might not survive, who might require years of costly medical attention, who might die and leave her with nothing to show for the risk she had taken. She wanted a healthy baby she could present immediately as the miracle child everyone had been praying for. And so, while Ngozi drifted in and out of consciousness, believing in her exhausted haze that the healthy baby placed in her arms the following morning truly was the daughter she had carried, Beatrice arranged the switch with my complicity. A complicity I have regretted with every breath I have taken since that terrible night. The silence that followed stretched so long and so heavy that Ifeoma could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. I am Ngozi's daughter, she finally said, the words feeling foreign and enormous in her mouth. Not Kayamaka. Me. Yes, my daughter. Nurse Patience said, reaching across the small space between them to take Ifeoma's trembling hands in her own weathered ones. You are the true daughter of Chief Ibe and his first wife Ngozi. You were born strong and healthy that night, and through no fault or choice of your own. You were taken from the family that should have raised you and given to a poor woman who, though I believe she came to love you dearly, was never meant to be your mother. And the baby, Ifeoma could barely form the words. Ngozi's true baby, the one born early. Nurse Patience's face crumpled with fresh grief. She did not survive the transition, my daughter. 2 weeks after the switch, in the care of a woman who had been paid to keep a fragile, premature infant she had no resources or medical support to properly care for. The baby's weak lungs finally failed her. She died quietly in her sleep, in a small mud house not so different from the one you grew up in. Though you never knew it. Though the woman who raised her buried her grief in silence rather than risk exposing the arrangement that had put money in her family's pocket. Ifeoma sat frozen, tears streaming silently down her face, trying to absorb an impossible weight of grief and revelation all at once. A dead half-sister she had never known existed. A biological mother, Ngozi, whom she had never met. A father, Chief Ibe, who had died 5 years ago believing his true daughter had grown up strong and healthy in his own mansion, never suspecting that the girl he had raised was not his blood, and never knowing that his actual daughter had spent her entire life in poverty 200 kilometers away, scrubbing marble floors that, by every right of blood and law, should have belonged to her. And Ngozi, Ifeoma finally managed to whisper, My mother. What happened to her? Nurse Patience's grip on Ifeoma's hands tightened. That, she said softly, is a question I cannot fully answer, my daughter. Ngozi grew weaker in the months after the birth, and there were always whispers. Whispers I was too afraid to chase. Whispers about complications that seemed to worsen rather than heal under Beatrice's careful, watchful nursing. Ngozi died 8 months after you were born, officially of postpartum complications. But I have carried a suspicion in my heart for 26 years that I have never dared speak aloud to anyone, until this very moment. What suspicion? Baba Sunday asked quietly, leaning forward. That Beatrice did not want to risk Ngozi ever recovering fully enough to notice that the child she was raising did not carry a single one of her own features. That Beatrice, having already crossed one unthinkable line, may have found it easier to cross a second. The words hung in the small parlor like a physical weight, and Ifeoma felt something inside her chest crack open entirely. Not just grief for a mother she had never known, not just horror at the possibility that her own biological mother might have been murdered to protect a lie, but a fierce, burning anger unlike anything she had ever allowed herself to feel in 4 years of swallowed tears and silent humiliation. Every slap, every hungry night, every hour spent kneeling on sharp gravel under a punishing sun, every lie she had been forced to tell her own parents, her real parents, in every way that mattered except blood, the two people who had loved her fiercely despite their poverty. Every single moment of suffering Madame Beatrice had inflicted upon her had been, in some twisted way, an extension of the woman's decades-long effort to bury a truth that had cost 2 lives already, and was now circling back, inevitably, unstoppably, to claim a third. If you have tears in your eyes right now, you are not alone. Take a moment, breathe, and if this story is moving something deep in you, let us know in the comments below. Tell us. What would you have done, in Ifeoma's place, learning a truth this enormous? And please, like this video if you believe truth always finds its way home, no matter how long it is buried, no matter how much money is spent trying to keep it silent. It was Baba Sunday who finally broke the heavy silence that had settled over the small parlor. Nurse Patience, he said carefully, would you be willing to put what you have just told us into a signed statement? Something the barrister could use? Something that could stand up in a court of law? The old nurse's face tightened with old fear, and for a moment, Ifeoma feared she would refuse, would retreat back into the silence she had guarded for 26 years. But then something shifted in her expression. A weary, resolute courage that seemed to settle over her tired shoulders like a mantle finally being lifted after decades of carrying it alone. I kept records, she said quietly. I was young and frightened that night, but I was not foolish. I documented the delivery times, the birth weights, the assigned bassinet numbers before the switch occurred. I kept a private diary of that period, hidden away for 26 years, because some small part of me always knew that one day, someone would come looking for the truth, and I did not want to have nothing to offer them but my failing memory. She rose slowly from her chair, her joints protesting audibly, and made her way toward a small wooden trunk tucked in the corner of the room. I will give you everything I have kept. And yes, I will sign whatever statement is needed to make this truth impossible to deny. For the first time since fleeing through Madame Beatrice's compound gate in the rain 3 years earlier, for the first time, perhaps, in her entire adult life, Ifeoma allowed herself to feel something that was not fear, not grief, not exhaustion, but a fierce, trembling flicker of hope. She had proof now. Real proof. A witness willing to testify. A path forward that could finally end 26 years of stolen identity and buried lies. But hope, as Ifeoma would learn within the very hour, is a fragile thing in the presence of danger that has already found you. The first sign that something was wrong came from outside. The distant, growing rumble of multiple engines approaching the quiet street. Engines that did not belong to the usual gentle traffic of Okada riders and market trucks that passed through Orinta's back roads. Baba Sunday was on his feet instantly, moving to the window, his weathered face going rigid with alarm as he peered through the gap in the curtains. 2 vehicles, he said tightly. Black SUVs. They are slowing down at the end of the street. Nurse Patience's hands, still clutching the small wooden trunk of documents, began to tremble violently. They have found us. How? Ifeoma's voice cracked with panic. We took the back roads. We were so careful. It does not matter how, Baba Sunday said grimly, already moving toward the small back door of the bungalow, his old body suddenly moving with an urgency that belied his age. What matters is what we do in the next 60 seconds. Nurse Patience, is there a way out through the back? Through my neighbor's compound, yes, and then a bush path that leads toward the old market road. The old nurse was already moving, thrusting the wooden trunk into Ifeoma's arms with surprising strength. Take this. Everything you need is inside. Go now, both of you. I am an old woman. They have no reason to harm me if I am the only one they find here. I cannot leave you to face them alone, Ifeoma protested, even as Baba Sunday was already pulling her toward the back door. You must, Nurse Patience said fiercely, her frail hands gripping Ifeoma's shoulders with sudden, desperate strength. You are the one who matters now, my daughter. You are the one who can finally bring the truth into the light, who can finally give Ngozi's death some meaning after 26 years of silence. I have lived my life already. Go. Protect what I have given you. Protect the truth. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from the front of the house, followed by heavy footsteps approaching the front door, and a voice Ifeoma recognized instantly, cold, controlled, and dripping with a fury that had clearly been building for hours. Open this door, Madame Beatrice's voice called out, sharp enough to cut through the thin bungalow walls. I know you are in there. I know everything now. Open this door before I have it broken down. Baba Sunday shoved Ifeoma through the narrow back door. The wooden trunk clutched tight against her chest, and they stumbled together into the overgrown compound of the neighboring house, ducking low beneath a line of hanging laundry, the sound of splintering wood and Madame Beatrice's furious voice growing fainter behind them as they pushed deeper into the tangled bush path Nurse Patience had described. They did not look back. They could not afford to. But even as they ran, gasping, branches tearing at their clothes, the fading afternoon light slipping toward evening around them, Ifeoma's mind kept circling back to the same devastating question, over and over, with every desperate stride. Would Nurse Patience survive whatever Madame Beatrice was about to unleash upon her? And even if Ifeoma and Baba Sunday managed to escape into the bush with the trunk of evidence clutched tight in her arms, was there any version of this story where Madame Beatrice, a woman who had already, perhaps, taken one life to protect her secret, would simply allow Ifeoma to walk into a courtroom and destroy everything she had spent 26 years building? The bush path finally opened onto a narrow dirt road as the sun began sinking low and orange behind the palm trees. And it was there, breathless and trembling, that Baba Sunday's old sedan, which he had wisely left parked 2 streets away from Nurse Patience's bungalow rather than directly outside, came into view. But standing beside it, arms crossed, waiting with a patience that made Ifeoma's blood run cold, was the man from the motorbike who had tracked them since the toll gate that morning. And behind him, 2 more men Ifeoma did not recognize, their faces grim and purposeful in the fading light. Going somewhere? The man said quietly, pushing himself off the car with unhurried menace. Madam has been expecting you back for quite some time now. Baba Sunday stepped instinctively in front of Ifeoma, his old shoulders squared despite the visible tremor in his hands, but the man from the motorbike only smiled, a thin, unhurried smile that made the hairs rise on the back of Ifeoma's neck. Old man, he said, you are not the one we came for. Then you will have to go through me to reach her, Baba Sunday said, his voice steadier than Ifeoma had ever heard it. For a long, suspended moment, nobody moved. The evening wind rustled through the palm fronds overhead, carrying with it the distant bark of a dog and the fading orange light of a sun that seemed, to Ifeoma, entirely too indifferent to the terror gripping her chest. She clutched the wooden trunk tighter against her body, feeling the weight of 26 years of buried truth pressing into her ribs, and she understood, with sudden and startling clarity, that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but whether the truth Nurse Patience had risked everything to hand over would ever see daylight at all. Then, from somewhere behind the 3 men, headlights swept across the darkening road, and a 4th vehicle, this one unmarked, black, moving fast, screeched to a halt at an angle that blocked the narrow dirt road entirely. The man from the motorbike turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving toward something concealed beneath his jacket, but he froze when the car door opened and a tall figure stepped out into the fading light, adjusting his gray jacket with a calm, deliberate authority that seemed to still the entire scene. "I would advise you to step away from that young lady," Barrister Emeka Solari said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet road. "Unless you would like to explain to the Rivers State Police exactly why 3 men are surrounding a minor's, forgive me, a young woman's, vehicle on a public road at dusk." Ifeoma's breath caught. The barrister, the very man whose visit to Madame Beatrice's mansion, had set this entire nightmare into motion. "How?" she started, but Baba Sunday's hand found her shoulder, steadying her, and the barrister was already walking toward them, his eyes moving quickly, assessingly, from the wooden trunk in Ifeoma's arms to the 3 men who had begun exchanging uncertain glances among themselves. "Barrister Solari," Ifeoma managed. "How did you find us?" "An old man's phone call," Solari said, glancing meaningfully at Baba Sunday, and Ifeoma understood then. The moment Baba Sunday had switched. "An old man's phone call," Solari said, glancing meaningfully at Baba Sunday, and Ifeoma understood then. The moment Baba Sunday had switched off his phone during their frantic escape from the highway, he had not simply gone silent. He had, at some point during their journey, found a way to reach out. "Sunday called my office this morning, before your journey even began, and told me everything he suspected. I have spent the day making calls of my own. To St. Augustine's Hospital, to the Amman's Village Health Center Records Office, to a retired midwife who confirmed certain irregularities in a set of birth records from 26 years ago that I have long suspected, but never been able to prove." He paused, his gaze settling on the wooden trunk still clutched tight against Ifeoma's chest. "It appears you have found something far more valuable than anything my own investigation has managed to uncover." The man from the motorbike, sensing the shifting tide, took a hesitant step backward. "We were only asked to escort the young lady back to the family house," he said carefully. "There is no trouble here." "Then you will have no objection," Solari said smoothly, pulling out his phone with an unhurried confidence that made the 3 men visibly deflate. "To my colleague from the Rivers State CID joining us presently. I called ahead the moment I received word that Madame Beatrice's men were converging on this location. They should arrive within minutes." It was not entirely true. Ifeoma would learn later that no police officer was, in fact, on the way at that exact moment. But the bluff worked precisely as intended. The 3 men exchanged one final uncertain look before retreating to their vehicles. Engines roaring to life, tires kicking up dust as they sped back down the narrow road and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Only then did Ifeoma allow her knees to buckle, sinking down onto the roadside dirt, the wooden trunk still cradled protectively in her lap, sobs finally breaking free from a chest that had held them contained for what felt like a lifetime. "Nurse Patience," she gasped, remembering suddenly, urgently. "Madame Beatrice went to her house. We left her there alone. We need to. I already sent someone," Solari said gently, kneeling beside her. "A local contact of mine reached the bungalow shortly after Madame Beatrice's arrival. She is safe, though shaken. Madame Beatrice left the moment she realized her men had failed to intercept you here, and I suspect she is already racing back to Lagos to consult with whatever remains of her legal counsel before this matter becomes entirely unmanageable for her. If you have been holding your breath through that entire sequence, you are not alone. Comment below with a single word describing how you are feeling right now. And if this story has kept you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe now, because stories built on suspense and unexpected twists like this one are exactly what this channel exists to bring you. There is still so much left to uncover, and the truth is only just beginning to surface. It took 3 more months, 3 months of legal proceedings, forensic document verification, and a DNA test that Barrister Solari arranged through the Rivers State CID's forensic partnership, comparing a sample from Ifeoma against preserved medical records belonging to the late Chief IB. Before the truth Ifeoma had carried in that small wooden trunk was formally, undeniably confirmed. Those 3 months were not easy ones. Madame Beatrice did not surrender quietly. She hired the sharpest lawyers her remaining fortune could still afford, contested every filing, attempted twice to have Nurse Patience's testimony dismissed as the unreliable ramblings of a senile old woman, and even, in a final desperate move that nearly succeeded, tried to have Ifeoma discredited by producing a forged set of hospital records claiming Kayamika's birth had occurred exactly as always claimed. But forged documents, as Barrister Solari had told Ifeoma with quiet confidence during one of their many late-night preparation sessions, rarely survive close forensic scrutiny, and the paper Madame Beatrice's team had used bore a watermark that had not existed at St. Augustine's Hospital until 4 years after the date claimed on the falsified certificate. Throughout those 3 tense months, Ifeoma stayed hidden in a small guest house Solari arranged in Orinta, protected by round-the-clock security the barrister insisted upon after Madame Beatrice's earlier attempt to intercept her. Baba Sunday stayed close by too, having lost his position at the IBE household the very night of their escape, but refusing every offer Ifeoma made to help him find new employment. "I did not help you for payment, my daughter," he told her one evening, as they sat together on the guesthouse veranda watching the sun set over Orinta's quiet rooftops. "I helped you because I carried a silence for 26 years that was slowly poisoning my own soul. Watching you find your truth has been payment enough." The most difficult conversation of those 3 months, however, was not with Baba Sunday, nor with Barrister Solari, nor even with the various investigators and forensic officials who moved through Ifeoma's life during that turbulent period. It was the phone call she finally made to her parents in a man's village. The parents who had raised her with love and warmth despite their poverty. The parents whose faces flashed before her eyes every single time she had endured Madame Beatrice's cruelty over the past 4 years, believing she was suffering to secure their financial future. Mama Adiz wept for nearly 10 minutes straight before she could form a coherent sentence. And when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with a guilt Ifeoma had never expected to hear. "We knew," Mama Adiz finally confessed, her voice breaking. "Not everything. Not the full truth of what happened at that hospital. But your father and I always suspected something was different about the circumstances of your birth. There was a woman, a nurse, I believe now it must have been Nurse Patience herself, who visited us privately 3 days after we brought you home from the clinic, urging us never to speak of certain details to anyone, pressing an envelope of money into your father's hands that seemed impossibly large for a family in our position. We told ourselves it was simply charity. Simply kindness from a stranger moved by our situation. We chose, God forgive us, not to ask the questions we perhaps should have asked." "Mama," Ifeoma whispered, tears streaming freely down her face, "I am not angry with you. You raised me with more love than I could have received anywhere else in this world. Whatever blood runs through my veins, you and Papa are my true parents in every way that matters. Your father," Mama Adiz continued softly, "always suspected there was something more to your story. It is why he tried to tell you, the morning you left for Lagos, though he could never quite find the courage to speak the full truth, not knowing himself exactly what that truth might be, only sensing that something about your arrival into our family carried a weight larger than an ordinary birth." That conversation, more than any legal victory that would follow, finally allowed something long knotted in Ifeoma's chest to loosen. She realized, standing at the intersection of 2 entirely different truths that did not have to cancel each other out. She was the biological daughter of Chief Ibe and his first wife Ngozi, robbed of the life and identity that should rightfully have been hers. And she was also, unquestionably, unshakably, the daughter of Papa Namdi and Mama Adiz, the 2 people who had loved her fiercely through every hungry night and every hard season, asking nothing in return but her safety and happiness. Both truths were hers to carry. Neither one diminished the other. The court date, when it finally arrived on a bright Tuesday morning in the courthouse in Umuahia, drew a crowd far larger than anyone had anticipated. Word of the scandal had spread through business circles and society gossip alike, and by the time Ifeoma walked up the courthouse steps beside Barrister Solari, flanked by Baba Sunday and a frail but determined Nurse Patience, journalists and onlookers had already gathered in numbers thick enough to require additional security. Madame Beatrice sat rigid at the defense table, her once immaculate composure now visibly cracked, deep shadows beneath her eyes betraying weeks of sleepless dread. Beside her sat Kayamika, and it was Kayamika's face, more than anyone else's in that crowded courtroom, that Ifeoma found herself watching most closely as the proceedings began. Because whatever Madame Beatrice's crimes, whatever calculated cruelty had driven her decisions over the past 26 years, Kayamika herself was, in her own way, another casualty of her mother's lie. A young woman who had grown up believing herself to be the biological heir to an empire she had never actually been entitled to, who was about to learn, in front of a courtroom full of strangers, that her entire identity had been built on a foundation of stolen truth. The proceedings stretched across nearly 6 hours. Nurse patients testified with a quiet, steady dignity that seemed to draw strength from somewhere deep within her frail body, describing the events of that terrible night 26 years earlier in careful, unwavering detail. Her private diary entries entered as evidence alongside the forensic DNA results that had already confirmed, beyond any reasonable legal doubt, that Ifeoma carried the biological signature of both Chief Ibe and the late Ngozi Ibe. Madame Beatrice's lawyers fought fiercely, questioning nurse Patience's memory, challenging the chain of custody on the old photographs, attempting repeatedly to paint the entire narrative as an elaborate scheme orchestrated by a jealous, opportunistic house help seeking to steal a fortune that was never rightfully hers. But when Barrister Solari finally called Baba Sunday to the stand, and the old driver recounted, in his slow, deliberate voice, the details of that long-ago drive to a man's village that he had carried silently in his conscience for over 2 decades, something in the courtroom's mood shifted decisively. And when Ifeoma herself finally took the stand, describing not the fortune she stood to inherit, but 4 years of slaps and hunger and forced silence, for years of being made to feel like nothing in the very house that, by blood and by law, belonged to her. Several members of the gallery, hardened journalists included, were seen quietly wiping tears from their eyes. It was during a brief recess, as Ifeoma sat alone in a small waiting room gathering her composure before the final phase of testimony, that Kayamika appeared in the doorway, her usually immaculate appearance now disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from hours of silent weeping in the courtroom gallery. For a long moment, neither young woman spoke. For years of accumulated resentment and cruelty hung heavy in the small space between them. "I did not know," Kayamika finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, stripped entirely of the haughty confidence Ifeoma had known for 4 long years. "I swear to you, I did not know any of this. I grew up believing I was her daughter, believing Chief Ibe was truly my father. Every memory I have, every birthday, every moment I thought was real." Her voice broke completely, and she pressed a trembling hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Ifeoma studied her for a long moment, feeling something complicated stir in her chest. Not quite forgiveness, not entirely absent of old anger, but something softer than either. Something that recognized in Kayamika's shattered composure a grief that mirrored her own. "I believe you," Ifeoma finally said quietly. "You were as much a victim of her lies as I was, Kayamika. Just in a different way." "How can you say that?" Kayamika whispered. "After everything my mother did to you. After everything I allowed to happen, everything I said, every time I looked at you like you were nothing." Ifeoma was quiet for a moment, thinking of Papa Nambi's unfinished sentence, of Mama Adi's tearful confession, of Nurse Patience's 26 years of guilt finally set down like a burden too heavy to carry any further. "Because holding on to hatred for you," Ifeoma finally said, "would not give me back a single one of the years I lost. It would not bring my mother Ngozi back to life. It would not undo a single slap or a single hungry night. All it would do is let your mother's cruelty live on inside me, long after the truth has already set both of us free from her lies." She paused, meeting Kayamika's tear-filled eyes directly. "I do not know what our relationship will look like moving forward, Kayamika. But I know I do not want to spend the rest of my life carrying the same poison that poisoned your mother for 26 years. When the judge finally delivered the verdict late that afternoon, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that Ifeoma could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The same heartbeat she had heard pounding through 4 years of fear, through a desperate flight in the rain, through a terrifying chase along back roads, through a confession in a small yellow bungalow that had changed everything she thought she knew about herself. The court formally recognized Ifeoma as the legitimate biological daughter and rightful heir of the late Chief Ibe, entitled under the terms of his original will to the full estate that had been fraudulently withheld from her for 26 years. Madame Beatrice was found to have knowingly orchestrated the infant switch, and was additionally referred for further criminal investigation regarding the suspicious circumstances surrounding Ngozi Ibe's death, a case that would, in the months that followed, ultimately result in a manslaughter conviction after new forensic evidence re-examined medical records revealing traces of a substance inconsistent with natural postpartum complications. Finally confirmed what nurse patients had suspected, but never dared voice aloud for over 2 decades. Kayamika, though she had committed no crime herself, lost the inheritance she had believed was rightfully hers, and with it, the lavish life she had known since birth. But in the months that followed the trial, something unexpected began to grow between the 2 young women who had once occupied such radically different positions within the same household. Not quite sisterhood, not entirely free of old wounds, but a tentative, evolving understanding built slowly across careful conversations and shared grief over a mother, in Kayamika's case, whose crime she had never asked to inherit. Ifeoma used a portion of her newly recognized inheritance to fully fund her father's long-needed hip surgery, watching with tears streaming down her face as Papa Namdi walked, for the first time in years, without the low stool that had defined so much of her childhood memories of him. She built her parents a proper house in a man's village, complete with a solid zinc roof that would never again leak during the rainy season. And true to the dream she had carried since childhood, she enrolled in nursing school, not because she needed the income any longer, but because healing others remained, even now, even after everything, the truest calling of her heart. Nurse Patience, in her final years, was welcomed into Ifeoma's newly built family compound as an honored guest, finally free of the guilt she had carried alone for 26 years, finally able to rest in the knowledge that her long-overdue confession had brought justice not just to Ifeoma, but to the memory of a first wife named Ngozi whose gentle spirit had been erased from history for far too long. And Baba Sunday, the quiet driver who had carried a stolen photograph and a guilty conscience for nearly 3 decades, was given a permanent position overseeing the family compound in Amans, not as a servant this time, but as an honored elder, treated with the dignity and gratitude he had earned through one courageous act of conscience that had finally broken a chain of silence 26 years in the making. If this story has taught you anything tonight, let it be this. The truth does not disappear simply because powerful people bury it beneath money, silence, and fear. It waits. Sometimes for years. Sometimes for decades. But it waits patiently for the moment someone brave enough finally chooses to dig it back into the light. Ifeoma often thinks back, even now, to that rainy night when she fled barefoot through Madame Beatrice's compound gate, carrying nothing but a folded photograph and a desperate, trembling hope that somewhere beyond that darkness, the truth of who she really was might finally be waiting for her. She thinks of her father's unfinished sentence, spoken so many years ago on the morning she left for Lagos. There is something about you, Ifeoma. When the time is right, you will understand. She understands now. She understands that a girl born into poverty was never, in truth, poor at all. That the wealth stolen from her at birth was never as valuable as the love that raised her in its absence. And that the courage it took to uncover a stolen identity mattered far more, in the end, than the fortune that identity ultimately restored to her. If this story touched something deep inside you tonight, please subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that truth always finds its way home. And leave a comment below telling us the biggest lesson you are taking away from Ifeoma's journey. Because somewhere out there tonight, another Ifeoma is scrubbing a marble floor she does not know is rightfully her own, waiting for her own moment of unexpected justice. And perhaps, just perhaps, her story is only just beginning.